When my son told me I was having a breakdown, I didn't argue with him. I just kept packing. I was 64 years old. I had spent 38 years working for the same electrical supply company in Hamilton, Ontario. I had a decent pension coming in, a little bit of CPP on top of that, and a house that was worth more than I ever imagined it would be when Ann and I bought it back in 1989. By most measures, I had done everything right. I had followed the plan, and the plan had worked. So why, every Sunday evening, did I feel like something was slowly collapsing inside my chest? My name is Alan, and this is the story of how I sold my house in Hamilton, packed 2 bags, and moved to the Philippines at 64 years old. My kids thought I had lost my mind. My brother told me I was being selfish. My neighbor of 22 years said, and I remember his exact words, "Alan, you're going to get yourself killed over there." What none of them understood was that I wasn't running away from anything. I was trying to solve a problem I had been carrying for 3 years without a name for it. And over the 14 months since I landed in Cebu, I've learned 10 things that completely changed the way I think about retirement, about money, about loneliness, and about what it actually means to be alive. I'll get to all of it. But first, let me tell you what was really happening back home, because I think a lot of Canadians will recognize it, even if they haven't said it out loud yet. I retired at 61, which honestly felt like a victory at the time. 3 years before the traditional age, I had been careful with money my whole adult life. Not obsessive about it, but careful. Ann and I had never carried credit card debt. We maxed out the RRSP when we could. We drove the cars until they weren't worth repairing. And when she passed away in 2019 after a very short battle with pancreatic cancer, I inherited a life insurance payout that I never wanted and never would have asked for. So by the time I stopped working, I was, by most definitions, fine. But fine and good are very different things. And it took me embarrassingly long to figure that out. The first year of retirement was actually okay. I kept myself busy. I cleaned the garage. I took a woodworking class at the community center. I visited my daughter in Calgary twice. I watched more hockey than any reasonable adult should watch. I told myself I was decompressing, that this quiet was what I had earned, that the stillness would eventually feel like peace. It never did. The second year was harder. The days started blurring together. I noticed I was eating the same 5 meals on a rotating schedule, not because I loved them, but because planning something new felt like more effort than it was worth. I stopped calling people first. I waited for them to call me. They called less and less. Not because they didn't care, I know they cared, but they had their own lives, their own kids, their own jobs and worries and Wednesday evenings packed full of things that needed doing. I understood that. I just didn't have anywhere to put the hours. I want to be careful here, because what I'm describing doesn't sound dramatic, and it wasn't. There was no crisis, no rock-bottom moment, no single terrible day I can point to. It was more like what happens to a house when you stop maintaining it. Nothing falls apart all at once. It just slowly becomes less than it was. The moment I remember most clearly was a Tuesday in February. I had driven to the grocery store, bought exactly what I needed for the week, come home, unpacked everything, and then stood in the kitchen for several minutes with nothing to do next. It was 10:47 in the morning, and I thought, this is my life now. This is what I built it for. That question stayed with me for months. I started reading, then watching. There were forums online, YouTube channels, Facebook groups full of Canadians and Americans who had made what they called the move. Most of them were talking about cost of living. And yes, cost of living mattered to me. Heating bills in Hamilton are not a joke. Property taxes on a house I was living in alone were approaching $8,000 a year. But cost of living wasn't the thing that finally pushed me to book the flight. What pushed me was a comment I read from a man who had retired to Cebu at 67. He said, and I've thought about this sentence many times since, I didn't come here to save money. I came here because I didn't want to disappear quietly. I didn't want to disappear quietly either. And that became the first thing I learned. The biggest risk in retirement isn't making a change. It's deciding that where you are is safe enough to stop. I want to say something about the decision process, because I know some of you watching this are somewhere in the middle of it. I spent 8 months researching before I booked a single flight. I read every forum post I could find. I watched videos about healthcare, about visa requirements, about whether my Canadian pension would transfer, about traffic and weather and internet speeds. I made spreadsheets. I lost sleep. I had long phone calls with my son Patrick, who is an accountant and who has a gift for identifying every possible way something could go wrong. And Patrick found many possible ways. But here is what I've come to believe. At some point, more information stops helping and starts just giving you more reasons to be afraid. You can research yourself into paralysis, and paralysis, dressed up as caution, is still a choice. It just feels more responsible. So I went. I arrived in Cebu City on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The heat hit me before I had fully stepped out of the airport. I remember standing on the pavement outside arrivals, sweat already forming on the back of my neck, surrounded by noise and movement and diesel exhaust and the sound of horns and laughter all at the same time, and thinking, what have I done? That feeling lasted about 3 weeks. The first thing that surprised me was the stress, or rather, the slow disappearance of it. I had expected the transition to feel difficult, and in some practical ways it was. Finding an apartment, figuring out the grocery stores, learning which roads to avoid at rush hour, understanding how everything worked. All of that took time and energy. But something else was happening underneath all of that adjustment, something I didn't notice until it was already gone. Before I left Canada, I had been carrying a kind of background tension that I had long ago stopped recognizing as tension. It was just the weather of my inner life. Something always needed attention. Something was always slightly wrong. A bill, a repair, a medical appointment coming up, a worry that hadn't resolved itself yet. Even when nothing specific was bothering me, I was braced for the next thing. I had lived that way so long I thought it was just what adulthood felt like. About 6 weeks after I arrived, I was sitting in a small, open-air cafe not far from my apartment. A ceiling fan was moving the air around slowly. Someone nearby was eating lunch and watching a basketball game on their phone, the volume low. A cat had decided that my feet were a good place to sleep, and I realized, in the middle of a completely ordinary moment, that I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I wasn't running through a list. I wasn't anticipating a problem. I was just there. I sat with that feeling for a long time, trying to remember the last time I had felt it. I couldn't. Now I want to be honest with you, because I think the internet already has enough people selling the idea that moving to Southeast Asia is some kind of magic cure. It isn't. I still have bad days. I still have weeks where I'm lonely or frustrated or wondering whether I made the right call. The roosters in my neighborhood start at 4 in the morning, and they are not subtle about it. There have been brownouts that lasted half a day. There was one rainy season month where the humidity made me feel like I was living inside a wet sock. None of that went away. But the background noise did. The low, constant hum of dread that I had been tuning out for years simply stopped. And the absence of it was extraordinary. The third thing I learned was about connection. And I'll be honest, I didn't expect this one. Back in Hamilton, I had what I would have called a full life. I had friends. I had neighbors I waved to. I had my son Patrick, and my daughter Vanessa, and Vanessa's husband, and my 2 grandkids who I saw at Christmas and in the summer. I thought that was enough. I think a lot of us in our 60s think that's enough, and we don't realize it isn't until something changes. In retirement, without the rhythm of work, without the daily proximity of colleagues and clients, and the incidental conversations that fill up a working week, I had become much more alone than I understood. I wasn't isolated in any dramatic sense, but I was going days without a real conversation. Days where the most substantive exchange I had with another human being was the cashier at No Frills asking if I had a PC Optimum card. I had stopped admitting that, even to myself. When I moved to Cebu, one of the first things I noticed was that people talked to each other, openly, without appointments. I went to buy bananas from a woman at a market near my building, and came away 40 minutes later knowing her name was Cora, that she had 3 children, that her eldest son was working in Riyadh, and that she thought the Canadian winter sounded like something from a horror film, which I told her was not entirely wrong. We had a conversation, a real one, about things that mattered to each of us, that started happening regularly. Not because I was going out of my way to be social, but because the culture around me was simply built differently. People introduced you to people. Neighbors checked on each other without it being a formal thing. I was invited to a birthday party for a man named Rodel, a barangay captain who lived 2 streets over, 3 weeks after I moved into my apartment. I didn't know Rodel well. I barely knew his nephew, who was the one who invited me. But I went because it seemed rude not to, and I sat in a courtyard with 60 people I didn't know, and ate food I couldn't always name, and managed a conversation that moved in and out of English and Cebuano, and I understood maybe half of it, and I had one of the best evenings I'd had in years. I thought about that on the tricycle ride home. Back in Hamilton, I had lived on the same street for 23 years. I knew my neighbors well enough to nod at them. I had never been invited to anyone's birthday. The fourth thing I learned had to do with independence. This one took longer to settle in. I was raised, like most men of my generation, with a very specific understanding of what it meant to be capable. You solved your own problems. You didn't ask for help unless there was no other option. You figured things out. And I had lived by that code my whole life. Anne used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Alan, you could be pinned under a refrigerator, and you'd try to figure out how to lift it yourself before calling anyone." She wasn't wrong. In Canada, this kind of independence was not only normal, it was respected. You kept your problems to yourself. You managed. You were a functional adult who didn't burden other people with your complications. What I found here was something different. Not the absence of individual responsibility, but a different relationship to other people. One afternoon I was trying to move a wardrobe in my apartment. I had a system. I had moved furniture alone before. But the wardrobe was heavier than I expected, and the hallway was narrower than I remembered, and I was standing there with one shoulder wedged against the doorframe, wondering if I was about to throw my back out, when my neighbor Dante knocked on the open door, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, and said something in Cebuano that I'm fairly sure translated to, "You're going to hurt yourself." He called his cousin from 2 floors up. They had the wardrobe in place in 8 minutes. Then they sat down and drank water, and we talked about the upcoming election for 20 minutes. No negotiation, no invoice, no sense that I owed them something significant. Just people helping a person who needed help. I've thought about that afternoon a lot since, about how many hours I've spent struggling through things alone, in the name of not being a burden, when there were people around me who would have been glad to help if I had let them. About how much of what I called independence was really just a kind of pride dressed up as self-reliance, and about how lonely that pride had made me, over the years in ways I hadn't noticed until I stopped living by it. The fifth thing I learned was about time, or rather, about what I had been doing with it. My whole life ran on a schedule. Even in retirement, even when there was no particular reason to be anywhere at any specific moment, I kept the schedule. I ate at regular hours. I ran errands with purpose. I felt vaguely guilty about any afternoon that didn't produce something visible. Back in Canada, we call this being productive. We're proud of it. We treat it as a virtue. Here, I encountered a different relationship to time. Things move slower. Not out of laziness or incompetence, but out of a different sense of what time is for. People aren't always in a hurry. Conversations are allowed to take as long as they take. A simple errand can expand to include a side conversation and a coffee and a detour, and that's considered normal, not a failure of efficiency. At first, this drove me genuinely crazy. I booked a plumber. He said he'd come at 2. He arrived at 4:30 with a cheerful expression and no trace of guilt. Back home, I would have been furious. Here I was surrounded by people who simply waited and then got on with things when he arrived. And after about 3 months of this, something shifted in me. I stopped checking my watch so often. I stopped treating every hour like it had to justify its existence. I started letting conversations go where they went, instead of mentally calculating how soon I could wrap them up. And slowly, without making a decision about it, I started noticing things I had been moving too quickly to see. The quality of the light in the early morning, the way the neighborhood smelled different on the days when someone nearby was cooking pork adobo, the sound of a school nearby letting out in the afternoon. Small things, completely ordinary things. Things that had been present in my life for 64 years and that I had rarely actually noticed. That's a strange thing to realize about yourself. That you've been so busy getting to the next thing that you've spent most of your life only half present in the one you're living. The sixth thing I learned was about comfort, specifically about the difference between being comfortable and being content. I had a bigger house in Hamilton than I have now. That is simply true. I had a finished basement, a 2-car garage, a kitchen with an island that Anne and I had renovated in 2011 and were very proud of. I also had rooms I never went into, closets full of things I couldn't identify, a storage locker in the basement containing the remains of hobbies I had abandoned, and purchases I had regretted, and boxes of things that had felt too important to throw away, but not important enough to actually use. When I decided to move, I had to deal with all of it. I sold what I could. I gave away more than I expected. I threw out a surprising amount. And at the end of it, standing in rooms that had been in my life for 31 years, mostly empty now, I felt something I didn't anticipate. I felt lighter. My apartment here is small by Canadian standards. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen that fits 2 people if they're patient with each other. A balcony where I drink my coffee in the morning and watch the street. I own almost nothing compared to what I had before. No car. A few pieces of furniture. A good coffee maker because there are limits to what I'm willing to sacrifice, and I spend almost no time managing my possessions. No lawn, no gutters, no driveway to shovel, or furnace to service, or roof to worry about. What I found was more time, more mental space, less of my attention consumed by the maintenance of things I had accumulated without quite meaning to. And in that space, I started asking a question I hadn't thought to ask before. How much of my energy, over the years, had gone into maintaining a life rather than living it? The honest answer was more than I was comfortable admitting. The seventh thing I learned was about success, and this one surprised me the most. I had a clear definition of success for most of my adult life. It looked like stability, a paid-off mortgage, a retirement account with enough in it, a job I could be proud of, a family I had provided for. Those were the markers. And I had more or less hit them. But since moving here, I've spent a lot of time sitting outside in the evenings watching ordinary neighborhood life happen around me. Kids playing in the street, groups of older men talking and laughing and doing not much of anything in particular, women setting up small plastic tables outside to share food and conversation. And I've noticed something. These aren't wealthy people by any measure I was raised with. Many of them work hard for modest incomes, but they seem genuinely, more consistently content than many people I've known in Canada who had significantly more. I kept trying to understand it, and eventually I came to this. They're not treating happiness as something that arrives later. They're not waiting for the next promotion, or the next purchase, or the year when things finally settle down. They're living the life they actually have, with the people who are actually around them, right now, today. That sounds simple. I know it sounds simple. But I spent 40 years not doing it. I spent 40 years oriented toward the future. Toward the next milestone, the next phase. The thing that would come after the current difficulty was resolved. And when retirement arrived, when there were no more next milestones lined up in an obvious sequence, I didn't know how to stop doing that. I kept waiting. I just didn't know what I was waiting for anymore. What I've learned here, slowly, imperfectly, in ways I'm still working on, is that enough is a real thing. Not a compromise, not a settling. A genuine, sustainable relationship with what you actually have. I'm not there yet, but I understand now that it's possible. And before I moved, I'm not sure I did. The eighth thing I learned was about fear. Specifically, about how much space I had given to fears that never actually materialized. Before I left Canada, I had compiled what I can only describe as a document of doom. Everything that could go wrong. The healthcare situation, because I was giving up my provincial coverage and would need private insurance. The crime statistics, because people on the internet are very eager to share crime statistics, especially for places they've never been. The food, the water, the heat, the insects, the language barrier, the corruption, the unstable electricity, the roads. I read about all of it. I read about it extensively, and by the time I actually booked my flight, I had frightened myself considerably. Then I arrived, and here is what actually happened. The healthcare question was the most significant, and I'll address it directly for those of you who are thinking about this seriously. I spent time before leaving researching private insurance options, and I found good coverage through an international health insurance plan that costs me considerably less than what I was paying for additional insurance in Canada after retirement. Cebu has private hospitals that are genuinely good. I've needed them twice. Once for a respiratory infection and once for a knee that needed imaging. Both experiences were professional, reasonably priced, and significantly faster than what I was used to at home. The other fears, one by one, turned out to be either exaggerated or manageable, or simply different from what I had imagined. Yes, the electricity goes out sometimes. I bought a good UPS battery for my electronics and a portable fan, and stopped treating it as an emergency. Yes, there are insects. There is a gecko who lives in the corner of my bedroom ceiling, and who I have come to regard with something close to affection, because he keeps the mosquito situation under control. Yes, the traffic is chaotic by Canadian standards, so I don't drive. Looking back, I gave months of anxiety to problems that either never appeared or that I handled without significant difficulty when they did. I'm not suggesting you skip the research. Please do the research. But at some point, the research shifts from preparation to avoidance, and avoidance disguised as caution is still just fear running the show. The ninth thing I learned was about gratitude. And I want to be careful here, because it sounds like something you'd read on a refrigerator magnet, and I don't mean it that way. I spent the first couple of years of retirement focusing on absence, what I no longer had, the shape that Anne had left behind, the energy I used to have, the career that had given my days structure and purpose, the social world that work had provided without my ever having to build it deliberately. I measured myself constantly against a version of my life that used to exist, and the current version kept coming up short. What changed here slowly wasn't that those absences stopped existing. It's that they stopped being all I could see. I started noticing mornings, genuinely noticing them. The way Cebu sounds at 6 in the morning is something I would not have been able to describe to you before I moved here, and now it's one of my favorite things. There's a particular rhythm to how a neighborhood wakes up. The sound of a broom on pavement, a radio from 2 apartments over, someone doing something with a motorcycle engine, the smell of garlic starting somewhere and drifting up. None of that is remarkable. None of it costs anything. But most of my adult life, I would have been awake for an hour before I'd noticed any of it. There was an afternoon, maybe 3 months ago now, when I was sitting on my balcony drinking my second coffee and watching a family across the street prepare for what looked like a birthday celebration. They were setting up tables and draping lights, and someone was blowing up balloons, and there was that particular quality of good chaos that happens when a lot of people are working on something together. I watched it for maybe 20 minutes. I didn't think about anything else. I was just watching people be happy, and it made me happy, and I didn't feel guilty about sitting there doing nothing except that. That used to feel like wasted time. It doesn't anymore. The 10th thing I learned, the one that made everything else make sense, was about what retirement actually is. I had understood it my whole life as a destination. You worked, you saved, you got to the end, and the end was retirement, and retirement was rest, and rest was what you had earned after decades of effort. That was the contract, the promise I had been living towards since I was in my 20s. What I found when I got there was that the contract had a gap in it. Nobody had told me what to do with myself after the rest part. Nobody had mentioned that a human being deprived of purpose doesn't simply become peaceful. Nobody had explained that the social structure of work, which I had never thought of as something I needed, was something I had depended on completely without knowing it. I came to the Philippines thinking I was solving a financial problem. My pension in Canadian dollars, converted and stretched, goes considerably further here than it does in Ontario. That's real. A reasonable apartment in a good part of Cebu City runs between 30,000 and 50,000 pesos a month, which at current exchange rates is somewhere between 700 and 1,200 Canadian dollars. Groceries, eating mostly locally, run me maybe $300 a month. Healthcare, with good private insurance, I've already mentioned. I live well. I don't worry about the end of the month. That part worked out. But the financial problem was never really the point. The point was that I was disappearing. Quietly, gradually, in a comfortable house in a nice neighborhood in a city that I had lived in for most of my life, I was disappearing. I had become a person who moved through days without leaving much trace in them. And something in me knew that, even before I could put words to it. That was the thing I was actually trying to solve. What I found here wasn't a cheaper life, it was a fuller one. More presence, more conversation, more ordinary moments that I'm actually inside of rather than passing through. More laughter at things that don't matter and less anxiety about things I can't control. My son Patrick came to visit last spring. He stayed for 2 weeks. He arrived skeptical, as Patrick does everything, with a list of concerns that he had organized because Patrick organizes things. By the end of the second week, he had eaten fish for breakfast 3 times, which he had previously described as insane, and he had spent an entire afternoon just sitting with Dante's family drinking mango juice and talking about nothing in particular, and on his last night he told me, quietly, that he thought he understood now. He didn't apologize for all the arguments. Patrick doesn't apologize. But he didn't need to. I understood what he meant. My daughter Vanessa still worries. She sends me articles about expat safety and asks questions about whether I'm eating enough vegetables, which, Vanessa, I am. She's coming in December with her husband and the kids, and I'm already planning what to show them, which restaurants to take them to, which parts of the city I want them to see. And I notice that when I think about that visit, I don't feel the dull, flattened quality that the future used to have for me in Hamilton. I feel something closer to genuine excitement, something closer to looking forward. I didn't expect to still be learning at 64. I assumed somewhere along the way that the important learning was behind me, that I had accumulated most of what I was going to figure out about life, and that what remained was just managing what I had. I was wrong about that. Not slightly wrong, significantly wrong. If you're reading this or watching this, and you're somewhere in the middle of the question I was asking myself 3 years ago, sitting at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in February wondering if this is really all there is, I want you to know something. Not that the Philippines is the answer. It might be. Or it might be something else. A different place, a different change, a different decision that the people around you will tell you is too late or too risky or too much for someone your age. But the question itself is worth taking seriously. The feeling that something is missing, even when everything is technically fine, is not ingratitude. It's not a breakdown. It's not a crisis. It's just your life, still asking to be lived. I came here to stretch my retirement. I ended up finding out it had barely started.